You're listening to the Digital Deep Dive, where we tackle the newest trends, strategies, and pain points shaping growth across the digital landscape. From Amazon and D2C to international expansion, join our host and e-commerce leaders across multiple industries for in-depth discussions on how to maximize your brands in the digital arena. Now, here's your host, Aaron Conant.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Digital Deep Dive podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Conant, and today we're going to dive into a big topic around AI that brands have. And we're not going to get into the minutia, but we're going to get into one of the biggest questions that I feel brands are trying to figure out, which is, where am I at today? How do I compare to my peers? And what do I need to do to get to step one? And so I had a good friend, longtime friend, James Thompson, connect me over to Kevin here and said, hey, you guys should talk. And anytime James says I should talk with somebody, I say, absolutely, let's jump on the line. And so we'd had a conversation, and I said, this is perfect for a podcast because what he's doing and what he's solving for brands is what a lot of people are asking for right now. And so, Kevin, I'd love you to jump in. Give a little background of who you are, your company, what you guys do. I think that's probably a good backdrop for the conversation. And then we can kind of just jump into it as a whole. Does that sound good?
That sounds awesome. And Aaron, thank you so much for having me. My roots are in direct consumer brand management and digital marketing. So it's always fun to have these conversations. So sort of the skinny on how I ended up starting Ascend AI is I was a direct-to-consumer brand owner for a number of years. I used to buy patents, and then I'd build digitally native brands on top of them. Some of those brands got to be pretty big and international and spending 8 figures on performance marketing. And then our friends in Cupertino back in 2017 made life really hard for digital marketers with iOS 14. And usually I have to explain that to audiences, but I imagine there was like a gut check from people out there who went through those days. And all of a sudden, all of your highly tuned performance marketing efforts sort of disappeared because you couldn't figure out who was doing what. So I had to lean into artificial intelligence via machine learning to make sense of billions and billions of points of data that I was spending across my brands. And I ended up building what you'd call a media mix attribution platform without actually realizing that that could be a business unto itself. But just to, I'm looking at you, Hyros and Northbeam and Triple Whale and all the rest. So I built a version of those before those existed, trying to make sense of my own data within my own organization. I sold those brands what feels like a few internet minutes before Mr. Altman dropped OpenAI on all of us without instructions. And I knew immediately that this was totally going to be the future of marketing, the future of business, possibly the future of humanity. So I stood up Ascend AI in December of 2022, and we've spent the last 3.5, 4 years working with brands globally on helping leaders understand the impact of AI, not just from an operational perspective, like, okay, yeah, obviously there's all of this operational improvement, but also looking at it from a more holistic perspective as far as how AI was going to affect the markets in which our clients were operating. And marketing and performance marketing in particular and brands are right in the crosshairs of this change that's going to be heading our way. So we work with brands to help them understand the operational elements, but we also go pretty heavy into the trends along AEO and GEO as far as optimization and being relevant going forward. We operate like pods that come in as a fractional office, and we will help brands transform themselves using AI.
So that begs then the question that most people are trying to figure out, and I kind of said in the opening, is where are they at? Where do you find brands at today when you go in there? Because I think we're, for the past 1.5 years, it's been this curiosity stage. But what's really rapidly happened, and I'm going to say in the last even like 4 to 6 months, really, is people have realized that, hey, you know what? It is here to stay. It is going to have a major impact. It's probably not going to completely replace everybody. And maybe that's because the cost is too high, or, you need a human in the loop or whatever it is. But they're now looking at it, okay, I need to do something here. I need to have a baseline. I don't even know where I'm at. Like, where do you find brands at today?
All over the map. It's absolutely fascinating that you could have three brands that are all of a comparable size. They're all selling in a similar brand vertical, and they could have entirely different levels of maturity between them. A lot of the differentiation actually comes from leadership. That if you have really strong founder executive leadership that leaned into this really hard and defined not only that it was a thing like 2.5 years ago, but that it was a thing that could fundamentally change the way you do business. You've been at this for a while and you've been doing things. If you're someone who is just sort of waking up to it now, you're kind of flailing around a little bit in the dark. And that also matters as far as the size of companies. I find brand and digital marketing to be really interesting because you can find these brands that are running tens of millions of dollars a year with like 2 people and maybe 3 extra VAs somewhere out there. Those people were digitally native when they were born, basically. And those brands outside of their revenue were right on this. And they leapt right in as far as doing the N8N type workflow augmentations. And they've been right on the cutting edge. And they were the first ones to adopt like OpenClaw or whatever the latest and greatest. And as you get bigger, it definitely slows down. So in sort of mid-market, funded, bigger, stable companies, they don't have as much agility as a lot of the smaller companies. So they're still sort of wrestling with that.
So leadership then, because it's been for a long time, people are saying data first, get your data in order first. But what I'm hearing, actually, it's a leadership aspect that's really setting that tone. And then maybe those leaders are figuring out, okay, step 2 is data. So number one, I'm a smaller organization. I got to make sure that I'm doing this more agile. I'm actually maybe at a bigger opportunity upside to be able to implement this stuff. I'm a mid-sized enterprise. Like, if I'm in the hiring, I'm an executive at those. I'm looking now to hire a leader in this space. And are you seeing like chief AI officers start to pop up, or what is this? If it's a leadership role, what does that look like? What do people need to be thinking about there?
So I absolutely love that you grabbed onto that because it is absolutely essential. It sounds a little funny, but one of the first things that we do with most companies is that we lean in with generally needs to be CEO, chair, or founder level of the organization, and we help them create an AI manifesto. And that goes beyond policy. At this point, most organizations have policy, like don't use free Chinese models and don't put PCI data in, like, et cetera, et cetera. But having a manifesto that explains how the organization is thinking about this, as opposed to either putting their head in the sand or just having like executive retreats where all the executives are talking about it. Because I'll go into pretty big organizations and I'll sit down with a CIO or a CEO, and they'll say things like, hey, we're a people first organization. We really want to lean into this technology to augment our staff. We don't really have any intention of disgorging anybody. And I'll ask them, does your staff know that? Because I promise you, in a lot of these verticals like marketing, people are losing their minds, that they really think that their job is on the line every single day. And it might be, right? But by putting forward a manifesto that aligns the expectations of the organization in terms of the direction that the organization is going, it gives people a bit of a roadmap that they can follow so that they can understand how they can grow with the organization. So as opposed to doing what a lot of people are calling job hugging, which is just like kind of keeping their heads down, they are given more latitude to lean into the technologies and break free. Not like I'm cheating at school by using GPT or a chatbot, but it actually becomes an expectation. On the end of that continuum, it's actually incorporated into performance. So we've provided you the tools. Are you using them? Guess what? We can see whether you're using them. Are you using them effectively in some way that is going to advance your job? Yes or no? And getting it all baked together aligns people. And guess what? Some people aren't going to make it because they're not in with the plan or they're not embracing the technology. But at least that's being telegraphed really clearly from an organizational perspective. On your other question, not to get overly long-winded, yes, the role of the CAIO is definitely starting to spring up all over the place. You see it as chief of innovation, but I find it pretty interesting because it matters where it sits in the organization. You can kind of tell how mature an organization is in its thoughts about this, because they might nest this role like deep under the CTO or under the CIO or somewhere else in the organization. But really, the right term, whether this is the term that's employed or not, is a chief human and technology officer. So Myriad pharmaceutical company is one of them that I know has done this, because it's not just a technology issue, it's actually a people issue as well. So yes, the role is starting to rise, but people haven't quite figured out where it sits in the hierarchy yet. And if I had to give some advice to your audience, is it needs to be quite senior, and it needs to have a heavy level of collaboration with both the tech side and the human side. So this is a role that works day in and day out with the CTO and the CHRO.
Yeah. Wow. So a few things to just respond to there. The manifesto piece is, I think, key. The reason I say that is you're right. There's a lot of apprehension. There's a lot of anxiety that's being pent up out there, because you're right. A lot of people I'm talking to, they don't know, but all they can see in the headlines is AI is going to replace jobs. AI is going to replace 90% of all jobs. So they're bombarded with that. And then there's some ambiguity at the top around how the company is going to use it. But they are hearing over and over again, use AI, use AI, use AI, be more efficient, use AI. And so the two things they're saying is use AI, and AI is going to replace you. Why would I embrace it at that point in time? So there's some apprehension about doing it. You have people who are naturally curious that sit on the cutting edge. But the other thing that people struggle with in this case, and I think this is, falling upon leadership, is I hear from brands, I'm being told every day to use AI. I know I have to use it, or I know I'll become obsolete. But the only thing I'm allowed to use is Microsoft Copilot. And that is, I think, coming out at the leadership level, which right now, as people try to understand, an organization, what can we allow? They immediately go right now to the safest infrastructure, I think, which a lot of people look at as, okay, our own instance of Microsoft Copilot sitting on our own data with, no outside tethers trying to, ping it for potential security breach or something. It's super interesting. Do you see that as well? Like, it seems like leadership, number one, they have the manifesto to explain, and the next one becomes, what is the tool set people are allowed to use, or what are the guardrails around evaluating new tool sets that get you outside of just the one or two that are corporately approved?
So I don't want to miss data, but I also don't want to over-index on it. This is something that is a bit of a pet peeve of mine, because there's so much money to be made in data cleansing and data structuring and data organization. And yes, you absolutely need to have a good house, or your house needs to be in order as far as data. But just basic data hygiene and labeling and such can go a really long way. If you're running ads and you're making sure that you're using consistent syntax, files have consistent syntax, because guess what? One of the things that AI is really good at is being able to pull not just from one giant data lake that's crazy expensive and it has a lake house and these crazy terms that these people use, and you're charging millions of dollars to get all this stuff in place. AI is really good about taking ponds and puddles and being able to pull data from different places. So if you're an agile organization, I don't want you to get overly wrapped up around like, oh, all the data has to be perfect. it needs to be good. Like you need to kind of figure this stuff out and you need to have some practice in there. But the AI itself can help you connect disconnected data sources. Anyway, so, but as far as what I would put as the second tier is that level of literacy, because the thing that organizations tend to do is they will buy a bunch of Copilot license or they'll buy a bunch of GPT licenses and they'll sprinkle them over the organization and they'll say, go have fun with it. And, okay, some people kind of use it as like, I think that the term I've heard lately that I really like is called sidecarring. And it's the idea that you use AI, like you pivot to it in your seat and you use it to do something specific. Oh, I want to do some data analysis. So I'm going to dump the data set and I'm going to do it. Or I'm going to pivot over this way and I'm going to write some ad copy or whatever. But sidecarring is kind of missing the point as far as being able to centralize a chatbot, because that is really what we're talking about here, as like an operating partner and encouraging people to incorporate it into their daily lives is really, really important. However, that also requires some more advanced data connections for it to really start working out. And this is sort of a takeaway for listeners as well. Like if you are not doing this, you probably should be, is have what's called an agentic harness. And I don't want to that's a term that gets tossed around a lot, but basically for most people, that's going to be Gemini, Claude, or GPT, and then have those connected to the appropriate data sources for individual people. So if you're a buyer, it's probably going to be connected to Meta. If you're an email, it's going to be connected to Klaviyo, but it's also going to be connected to Slack. It's going to be connected to your email. It's going to be connected to your project management tool, because now you've built context around what you're doing in your day, and you don't have to sidecar because the context is already right there in front of you as far as the chatbot. Do people do this? No, they don't. Not yet, because they start really struggling with, oh, who has access to what? Well, the answer is the organization knows who needs access to what. And you can kind of bypass a lot of like file restrictions. Like, oh, we can't let somebody in marketing accidentally get access to HR and salary information. Well, yeah, of course. You need to watch out for that sort of thing. But if their access is restricted to the tools that they're already using, it's hard for me to come up with very many reasons why you shouldn't give people that broad access if they know what they're doing with it. And at the moment, they still really don't, because it changes every 15 internet seconds, right? So then getting people exposure to, I'm not standing on my own soapbox, because this is hard for us too, but to engage an organization that can do dynamic training as opposed to a bunch of videos, because there's almost no point in having people watch a whole bunch of videos on training, because by the time the video gets cut and published, it's probably obsolete. So you have to figure out what that culture is internally that's going to encourage experimentation and encourage knowledge sharing and reward both of those for people who are doing that.
So are you then coming in to an organization and doing the evaluation, and then what the structure should look like, and then like the next steps and the laying out? Because this is what people do. This is so brand new. There's no current teams that are built out within organizations that know it all. I think there's saplings of these organizations that'll grow into fruit bearing trees someday, but right now it's not there. And I've seen a lot of paring down of the size of digital teams. These digital teams that exploded COVID, post-COVID, people are taking a step back and saying, okay, where do I really need to allocate people, and do we over-index? A lot of companies are saying yes, and so the digital space is getting pared down. At the same time, people are asked to do more, but there's some things we just talked about. Okay, but do more with what tools? It's almost like this. Maybe that's where you come in, is this outside expert that's coming in and saying, hey, let's do a baseline and let's get you up and going. And that's what it seems like.
I think that's fair. Organizations are always going to want to focus their efforts on the thing that has the fastest and most, valuable ROI, right? And in a brand, it's often in the marketing and customer acquisition stack somewhere. But the gains can be applied much more broadly. Yet they take their best and brightest and they put them on solving those really big problems, and they basically leave everybody else to figure it out for themselves. And when you're doing like an ROI analysis, your CTO or your CFO is like, oh, well, these projects have this sort of return. And your project, although it's still a six-figure type project because we're not going to have to hire somebody to fill that role, we just don't have the bandwidth to do it. And that leaves the manager or the independent contributor who's trying to figure this out at this kind of at a loss, because they're already probably crazy busy. They don't really know how to do this. And unlike people like me, they probably don't spend their weekends like messing around and figuring out what the latest and greatest approach is. So how do you solve that problem? And this isn't just me. This is echoed by movements by Anthropic and OpenAI. You hear this term of forward deployed engineer. And this is actually a term that comes out of Palantir. And it's the idea that you have to embed the person who has the specific skill set amongst the people who have the domain skill set. So there aren't a lot of people who know how to put these things together in a really strong way. So like what we will do is once we get through the road mapping, project identification, the policies, the manifesto, we're probably kicking off training, et cetera. We try and find those places where we can deploy one of our resources and be surrounded by smart people who are motivated, who don't necessarily need to be cutting edge vibe coders or solution finders, but they understand what the issue is and what the friction is between their CRM and their procurement and their quote system or whatever it is. Every system is different. Like that's sort of, it's all bespoke because it was all been duct taped together over years and years and years. So it's hard for me, even being pretty experienced, to come in and say, well, of course you just do ABC and then DEF and XYZ results at the other end, because I don't understand what DEF is because I haven't spent 15 years in the company that duct tape all these pieces together. But those people do. So you get them the right technical person who understands process and can break down what the tech layer is, what the process need is, and then start charging ahead with creating solutions.
So if I have mapping this out, then leadership has to be on board. Staffing has to be that thing. You're getting the right person in place from an AI standpoint. We've got the manifesto. We've got the data. We have to at least understand. And now we're building out the teams to kind of go execute on all of this. Like, would I miss, or then what's next? Because I mean, people sitting back right now, like that's enough.
That's enough.
That's enough anxiety for right now.
Well, the next piece of anxiety is that we haven't really even talked about agents and agent layers. So what our forward deployed engineers do are essentially creating the agent flows that connect all the dots and make the automations work. Well, there's a lot of movement in the market, and the cost basis is changing quite a bit. So if you're a smaller organization, do be careful about how much you're leaning into agentic automation without understanding the costs that can be involved in there. You might be surprised because the costs keep continuing to rise, and it's been a shock to a lot of organizations. But you can go a very, very long way, and I mean a long way in a smaller organization with just a Claude Max plan or the $100 GPT plan out there, and the ability to build things, and spending $10, $20, $100 a month on API calls, because you're not running it over 20,000 transactions. You're running it over a process that happens like, post podcast. Like the podcast needs to be sliced and diced and turned into content. Okay, well, that is kind of a lift, but it only happens once a week. So by doing using a API costs in there, it's 60 cents or whatever to process the podcast. But be mindful, if you are a high velocity organization, that if you have 25,000 transactions a month and you're doing something that's 60 cents a transaction, well, that's going to catch up with you in a hurry.
Yeah, I never thought about that. But as you're talking about it, you see all these things, and I hear, I would say, more from our tech partners that the overall cost of AI and the tokens is tripled now, or their bill for it has tripled in just the past few months here. And then is it sustainable? I guess at the end of the day, is it sustainable?
Well, it's changed the dynamics of SaaS and service. That SaaS used to be, you made this really heavy capital investment in building whatever the cool platform was, and you were losing money through by hand and fist as you did it. But once you launched it, it was like 90% gross margin. But what you're seeing is when you add variability, and this isn't a SaaS show, but it's important for you to understand because everybody listening to this employs SaaS vendors in some way, shape, or form. And my cold heart doesn't really care too much about them, but it's fair to understand that their basic economics are changing the more they add AI on top of it. And it's reducing their gross margins in a way that's impacting their shareholders and their stakeholders. And it's putting them under an enormous amount of pressure, which you're seeing in all of these different experimental like pricing, like usage pricing and all of these other things, because they certainly haven't figured it out yet, but their golden goose of 90% gross margins is pretty much gone.
Well, it's also interesting because I hear from a lot of brands as SaaS, goes up, their cost, they're thinking more and more about just building it on their own themselves. Because the way they look at it, in a lot of cases, I'm going to get everything I need from my Claude plan. But
let me respond to that because I love it. I mean, I love building things. I think building things is absolutely amazing. But building is not as easy as the internet is telling you. That you can spend hundreds of hours building something that's pretty robust and full featured that does what it needs to do, even if you have the skill set to do it. Building something is the best way to learn how to do things, right? So great. You have somebody who wants to build something, but carving out enough time so they can actually do it justice versus whatever the SaaS is that is currently occupying that space is definitely a leadership conversation to have. And in that respect, I do like to encourage people to build when it creates a competitive advantage for them in some way, shape, or form. That because of their bespoke processes, because of what they're doing as far as influencer outreach or whatever, it's just too much of a pain to use the off-the-shelf products that are out there to get the juice that you want out of the squeeze. So leaning into it, building that creates enterprise value, like it's goodness. But if it's something that's kind of pedestrian and like that somebody else is doing well, like particularly if it's anywhere adjacent to like regulation, like Gusto, like nobody loves paying a payroll software. Like it's not like a happy thing for them, but you're not going to reinvent Gusto, or at least you shouldn't, because it's like super fraught with risks and all these other things. So you're going to suck it up and you're going to continue to pay the dollars. The middle ground, and what I am seeing in a lot of different verticals, is you have these specialty platforms that are like ERP, inventory, WMS, whatever it is, that have sprung up around their vertical, and they're really overpriced and underfeatured, and everybody really hates them. And you look at those and you're like, okay, now I can finally build the ERP of my dreams that actually deals with the expiration of my product and all my warehouses and kitting. And that can be worth it. That can absolutely be worth it. And you can quantify it based on what you're actually paying on a per seat basis. A lot of these things are multiple thousands of dollars a month. So if you're going to allocate basically a man month into something, and it was, $24,000 a year you're spending on a platform, that's a pretty decent argument to make to a CTO, especially if you're getting the solutions you want. However, However, there's so much janky stuff that's being built that has security vulnerabilities. Like, you've got a well-meaning, really smart, tech-forward marketer who has never thought about cybersecurity ever in their life. And here they are, they're spending their weekend and they're building this thing, and it's like it can create risk. So you want to be a little bit careful, and you want to make sure that there are some adults in the room. Often these are experienced devs who are going to be kind of a downer on a lot of this, but they can help catch issues before they really get out of hand. And then on the micro level, I love the micro level. Like, we're actually going through this fun period where, like, creating an app takes you as long as it would take you to create a spreadsheet. So it's the idea of this disposable applet that you build for a specific purpose using Claude Code, Codex, whatever your choice is. And you string it together and it does its thing. And you're like, cool, good, done. Move on with my day. But it does its job a lot better than a spreadsheet would have. And it takes a comparable amount of time to do that. So this is interesting. Like, what work is going to look like. Brands, this is probably less important, but as a services business, like, increasingly, we're not going to give people reports. We're going to give people entire interactive websites that show them this, that, and the other thing that they can scan through, as opposed to having this linear PDF type document that they have to, like, scroll through, maybe, right? So these work artifacts are changing under our feet as well.
That's interesting. From the standpoint of, they could then, just like you would on any web page now, any executive can ask any question and just get it answered and have a page rendered to them that's unique to them.
Isn't it crazy?
I was going to ask, my next question would be like, where is this all going? But you kind of, you outlined a couple of things right there, the throwaway app piece, but also, as long as the data is there, the presentation becomes incredibly easy to do. Mm-hmm. And if we can get all the connections right. It's interesting you brought up the cybersecurity piece, just from the standpoint of, if you look back a few years ago, we'll do, 80 some odd dinners in a year. None of those were around cybersecurity a few years back. And now, 10+% are around cybersecurity, because it is, they're being driven, like we were saying, all day, every day to use AI. But then what can I plug in? And if I can't plug it, can I build it on my own? And then if I do build it on my own, what are the security implications? And how to resolve all of that? And it's the same thing. Some of these dinners, I think, are therapy sessions for a lot of the organizations that are there. They can kind of, commiserate together, because it is a tough thing to solve, especially with the pace that all this stuff is moving. What is that? I don't know. Number one, I don't know if you have any questions for me. I've just been picking your brain. This has been super fun. More than happy to answer any. But also, is there other things that are just around the corner that people should be thinking about?
Okay, so one does relate to security, which is, if you've paid any attention to the news, you know that Anthropic's Fable and Mythos have been banned, and there's a lot of politics that are surrounding that. But the fundamental fact is that these models are getting really, really, really dang good at security vulnerability detection, which is, in the hands of the good guys, is a good thing. In the hands of the bad guys is a really bad thing. So a PSA here is, if you think that you have robust security, you probably don't. I work with a lot of brands, and the amount of time I see some version of like Rover One as a password that lends itself to bank accounts is absurd. So anything that touches, first off, any password you use, and this is going to sound a little crazy, but any password you use needs to be run through 1Password, LastPass, Bitwarden, one of the others that are out there. Why? Why do I need to care that the YMCA like tennis scheduling thing needs to be in this password? Because what's happening is they crack the low security passwords that are at the YMCA, and they see Rover One. And then because of the speed of AI processing, they run every permutation of Rover One. And they know that R0 VER1 is one, and then there's hashtag or whatever, and admit it, like most of us have done this over the years. And then they brute force it. What do you mean? Rover 19?
I don't know what you're talking about.
So I like everybody's guilty of this.
You just go to every permutation. It's like, yeah, you could.
But that's what you don't get. That my high security Rover one is Rover 1919 whatever, etc. But you've given it like 80% of what it needs to crack your passwords. And then they go off on an incursion attempt and they hit all of your bank accounts and they hit all of this other stuff because the WISE like tennis scheduling thing was weak. So you need to be using like a password manager and give you the really long passwords. They're easier to use than they used to be. And anything that has to do with finances, like medical history, things that are sensitive, needs to have 2FA on it. And ideally, you probably shouldn't be using a phone. And I hate to say this because everybody uses the text thing because it's easy. But we're seeing like SIM card spoofing. So they'll park a van outside your office, and they'll find vulnerabilities in your network, and then they'll get into a phone, they'll spoof the SIM card, and then on top of all of this, they now can do 2FA to get into your Wells Fargo account. So that's fun that this stuff is all happening. But I encourage everybody to also have analog passwords. So for your payables, like if you're issuing big payments, there should be like a phone call and an analog confirmation. This shouldn't just be an email. If you're worried about it on a family level, like, my 85-year-old mother has a security code that just in case I ever call her from Tijuana, it'd be like trivial to create an avatar of me because I'm in media a lot to make that happen. So yeah, that's the PSA part, because I want to be like the bringer of fun, but like there's also like super scary like stuff that's happening around us. The agentic harness, and I don't want to lose in the weeds, like things where you should be, audience. Like at this point, you need to have a choice of one or multiple platforms, probably Anthropic or OpenAI, and probably, to be honest, a mix of the two because they do different things. And you need to have connections between them, because that context, which is what the LLM understands as far as connecting all of the different bits and pieces, keeps getting bigger. And that context layer for organizations that have it well connected is really, really valuable. On the one side, if you have like no context, yeah, GPT is super smart. Claude Opus is super smart. But once you have full context, they get so much better. So understanding that the context is going to continue to grow is really important. Otherwise the technology continues to advance. The line is always the AI that you see today is the worst AI you will ever see. And that may change at some point, but at this moment of time, we have a lot more growth to go. So if you're blown away by going into, Google's VO and creating videos, you ain't seen nothing yet. So it's growing by leaps and bounds. That will also come along with costs and complexity. And we don't have enough people who know how to do anything with it yet. So it's this weird maturation of, there's a Ferrari that's parked right there and it's got the keys in the ignition, and like, everybody's kind of shuffling around blind, not able to find it or figure out how a key works.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, this has been absolutely awesome. I'll be sure to have you back on. Maybe it's a quarterly thing. I don't know, just to stay on top of this. But thanks so much for your time today. Everybody, if you're looking to learn more, Kevin and his team at Ascend.ai, just all around great people, leaders in this space, training the biggest and the brightest and the best companies out there. I encourage you to reach out, find them on LinkedIn. But with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Digital Deep Dive. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks.